Hello, welcome to my 2020 EDUCAUSE presentation, The Problem with Digitization, It's You, Not Them. We're doing this as an on-demand session, so a little bit different than what we're used to. So I want to start off with an introduction. My name is Mark Nathanson. I'm a business process consultant at the University of Maryland. I'm in a group called Enterprise Planning and Continuous Improvement. We do process improvement and process analysis all over campus for a variety of clients. Because this is an on-demand session, I wanted to start off with my contact information. Here you can see my email, and what I want you to do is as I go through the presentation, if there's any areas that you have questions on or you would like more information, please shoot me an email. This will allow us to do a question and answer asynchronously, so I can still engage with you as an audience, even though I'm recording this at a time very different from when you will be watching it. So with that, let's jump right in. The era of digitization. We are in a time where things are becoming digital faster and faster. We see the smart revolution of smartphones, smart watches, even smart TVs and smart appliances. Some people are even integrating their entire houses to become smart homes. We're seeing an explosion of both digital devices as well as the digitization of work. In the United States, on average, there are 8 networked devices per person, and that figure is only rising. Additionally, there is a constant push to digitize work, administrative work, data collection, data analysis. All of these things are looking to incorporate some type of technology. And I'm not here to tell you that technology is bad. I happen to love it. I have my fair share of those 8 networked devices, but we can run into some problems. And what does that look like? Here are some headlines of implementations that have gone wrong, whether that be ERP system that was extremely expensive or an idea to go green that really ruined a company's processes. Here we can see some examples of taking a new technology, but ending with a potentially worse result. And often that worst result is extremely expensive. So these are problems that we can see in headlines and we see in other areas, but I wanted to focus in on a few specific smaller scale examples that we've seen here at the University of Maryland. The first was part of our hiring process. One of the iterations of that was the non-exempt hiring. And even zooming in further was the process of posting a job, for somebody to apply. So what was the current process for that? You had a bunch of information that you needed to put together, job description, salary information, that type of thing. You'd upload that to our relatively new hiring system. Then it would sit in a queue. That queue would wait until Friday in order to post the job. Then Friday came around, it would launch it to our internal job site as well as all of those different job aggregators like Indeed.com, etc. So when looking at this, I was really curious, what is the purpose of this queue? What was the previous process that led to this process? Because as we move forward, I wanted to make sure that I was understanding where everything was coming from. So it turns out that this previous process, very few people knew about it. But after many interviews, I was able to find one person who was able to shed some light. So it was a completely paper-based process. So same thing in the beginning, you'd have to get your job description and your salary information and all that together. This time it was in paper, not digital, but relatively similar. Then they would also wait till Friday, but on Friday, they would fax over the information, and then over the weekend, it'd get posted in the newspaper job section. So it turned out that the reason the previous process had that queue was they needed to send everything over to the newspaper on Friday in order to get it posted in the weekend job section, which I believe was the most effective way at that point to advertise. So we can see here that the old process was completely recycled moving in to this new IT system. Another example is our scholarship process. In the early days of scholarships, there weren't so many, so they were being processed manually. But as the volume increased, we wanted to find some sort of solution. So, 20 years ago, scholarship systems didn't really exist. This wasn't a huge market. And so we wanted to be creative. So what did we do? We decided, oh, well, we don't have a scholarship system, but we have a billing system. We bill people for things all the time. So why can't we just bill for a scholarship? And it turns out that with a few interesting steps, you can bill for a scholarship. You get the money, you just create a fake entity, give that fake entity the money, and then bill that entity for the money that you just gave them. So as you can see, with a lot of extra steps in there, you're able to bill for a scholarship. But as you can see, we recycled a process that isn't even meant for this. And it got to the point where this processing would take 3 full-time employees almost 8 weeks leading up to the semester. You can imagine the problems with that, where a student who is waiting on a scholarship for their tuition is unable to see the status of that money for 8 weeks. Sometimes that would be the difference of their classes getting dropped because they have unpaid balances. There were a lot of issues that we were seeing here, and it was all because this process was digitized in a way that it should not have been. So this leads me to a more recent example, our COVID medical leave. So in the beginning of the pandemic, we instituted a special type of leave if you tested positive for COVID. But obviously we needed some way in order to track that and notify the necessary individuals and get the information required to log it. So we recycled the way that we conduct most medical leave on campus, and that was a paper form. And so you print out the form, you would fill out the information and hand it around to your supervisor, the HR coordinator, the central HR, that sort of thing. The problem was the nature of this form was that you tested positive for COVID. That means that you have to be isolating and you can't engage with other individuals to pass this form around. And we can see that in this very quick transition to a remote working environment, there were all types of changes that just seemed to happen overnight, whether that be classroom lectures, meetings, exams, paperwork, conferences, or happy hours. It seemed that everything was just now Zoom or some other video conferencing software layered on top. That doesn't always have the best outcome. If you were to go to happy hour with 10 of your friends, that could be a lot of fun. If you go into a Zoom room with 10 people, it can be really hard to have really any type of conversation without one person talking and everybody else just sitting quietly and listening. So this is just an example of how you can't use the same old process, do the same old thing with technology on top and expect a better result. In the pandemic, we saw a serious instance of time pressure. Typically, time pressure is instituted from some sort of deadline or some sort of end of project or your supervisor saying that you need to do something. But in the pandemic, we saw a time pressure for safety. And this is something that was very new to a lot of us. But one of the difficulties is time pressure is a catalyst of poor process. The less time people have to work on it is often a correlation with the worst outcome that will be there. And the difficulty is that when there is very little time, the last thing people are thinking about is process, when maybe it shouldn't be. So we went through all of these problems, We went through, some of the situations that caused them, some specific examples. But what do? We can't go to a world where we never, implement technology. And that is not something that I am suggesting. Technology can be great as long as it's done in the right way. And that's why the solution is methodology. Here at the University of Maryland, you can see our Candyland version of our methodology. But the most important parts are people, process, tools, and data. You might be wondering, why is technology not one of those pillars? And technology is part of tools, but it is only a subset of tools, and the other areas are just as important. So let's dive in and explore those different areas. People. The most important part of people is to be inclusive, making sure that you are including each stakeholder group whenever you're doing some sort of implementation or redesign. When including them, you need to make sure to listen. Listen both because their ideas will be potentially very helpful, but also you need them to feel listened to. The next is to understand their perspective. A lot of what they might say could surprise you, could be different than what you're thinking, and that's because of their unique perspective. Understanding where they're coming from will help you understand why they're saying what they're saying. In addition, it will help to see how they're integrated within all of this. And last is build a relationship. It is critical to do this. The first three areas of being inclusive, listening to their ideas, understanding their perspective will really help to build a relationship, but it's important to focus on this as well. Not only because your stakeholders will provide the information you need to do a proper implementation or redesign, but also this is your first huge step in change management for any type of large scale project like this. This doesn't mean just sending a survey. Surveys can be extremely useful, but you need to engage with people on a personal level, whether that is done through a focus group or an interview or any other type of meeting like that. It doesn't matter as long as it's something that's personable, because you can't build a relationship with somebody via email or via a survey. Stakeholder inclusion is so important. I wanted to cover two of the large groups of stakeholders. The first are actors. This is what might typically come to mind of somebody who is actually doing something within the process. These are people that are inherently involved because they have to do something, whether that be upload a file, process some data, meet with a customer. They're doing something. The other side, though, are interested parties. These are people that are not necessarily taking action within a process, but they have a vested interest. One example of something like this is with the hiring process. The subordinate of a new employee might not be involved in the hiring process at all, but they have a vested interest in the best person being hired to be their new supervisor. They have a very different perspective than somebody in HR and somebody who might be supervising this new person, but they aren't involved, so typically they're overlooked. It is really important to be inclusive of both actors and interested parties. When we do a process project, we see that the interview list of stakeholders has usually a huge jump in growth. For the hiring process, we started with, I think it was 15 individuals, and that was mostly to represent all the different colleges and divisions across our campus. The end of that project, we were just about 50 interviews from all of the different stakeholder groups that needed to be represented in the different iterations that existed. So the next area is process. It is critical to map each current step. Even if you see a process that's so bad, you're like, we're going to blow this up and start over, you still need to see what's happening now, because that will potentially provide a lot of information, both from a change management perspective of how you're going to facilitate this change, but also from a, a people perspective of what are people used to, what are they doing now, what do they like, what do they not like. Even if you're going to, get rid of it completely, that can really inform what will be successful in the future. You also need to understand why. The great example of this is with the hiring process we went over earlier. There was a queue that waited until Friday to post a job. It would have been easy to say, great, there's a queue now, let's keep the queue. But finding out why allows us to get rid of something like that and decrease the time it takes to post a job, sometimes by up to a week. You also want to identify how people engage. Process is really important, but people have to interface with that process, and seeing how different people engage differently will help you to understand, what might work, what might not work. And the last is documenting from end to end. Sometimes we are not working on redesigning an end-to-end process, and that's fine. We'll kind of zoom in on one chunk. But if you don't look at what happens before and what happens after, you have the potential to cause problems. We say that local optimization causes global de-optimization, which basically means fixing one part of a process without understanding the rest can cause a lot of problems. Again, a process flow diagram, it's a great tool, but it's not a whole solution. There's a lot more here than just some shapes and arrows on a piece of paper. There are a few ways to redesign process. As you can see, the positive ways here are collaborative. We really like facilitated design sessions, as well as other collaborative approaches. What we don't want to see are recycling of process. This is one of the biggest areas where we see people go wrong, is recycling old process with a new technology. Thinking that the technology is the problem is in most cases wrong. And by using old process for new technology, it's like building a fancy skyscraper without a foundation. With no process foundation, it ultimately will collapse. And if it doesn't collapse, it's going to have some serious problems. So one example of a facilitated session is a backwards design. Wanted to jump into this. It is really useful to choose a tool like this when there's multiple zero value add steps and when you really need to, change the lens that your stakeholders are using. Way too often when you will talk to a stakeholder, they've been in a process, deep in a process, sometimes for decades. And it is really difficult for them to think of anything other than that process. Even when you're asking, how things should change, how should this be done? If they can only think in their current lens, then you need to do something to change it. So the backwards design is just what it sounds like. You start from the end with the outcomes that are needed, and then you work your way back in order to figure out what needs to happen for those outcomes, what are the most valuable ways to get to there. So an example of that is actually with the scholarship process that we talked about earlier. We started off in a room, a nice facilitated session pre-pandemic of what are all the outputs. There are three main stakeholder groups that needed something out of this. Financial aid needed the students' financial aid information in order to calculate the package. The cashier needed to make sure the scholarship check that was mailed in was deposited. And students needed to get the credit on their student account, but also know the status of their check. Was it received, in processing, deposited, that type of thing. So we had these outputs, we know what we needed. So then we had to work backwards. So we had representatives from each stakeholder group in the project, and we were able to map this out. We started from the very end, and we were able to place these outputs within the process. Doing this allowed us to completely remove that convoluted process of creating an entity to then bill the entity to get the money on the student's account. And not only were we able to do that, we were able to find a way that somebody in the beginning of the process could take one extra step to save a whole headache and work for people at the end. When everything was said and done with this redesign, after a facilitated session, we went back and remapped out the new process. We saw over a 60% reduction in number of steps needed to process a scholarship. Not only will this greatly decrease the amount of effort, but it also will make a better working experience for those individuals processing and really reduce stress for students who were waiting on their money in order to keep their classes and stay enrolled as a student. So last area are tools and data, and I combine those because very often they are related. So the first is to look at every tool involved. It is critical to look at every tool, no matter how small. The number of processes that have an Excel foundation shocked me when I started doing this. But even if it's just a spreadsheet, that's considered a tool. IT systems, tools. File structures, tools. All of those things that people are using are really important to look at to understand what is happening. The next is to document current limitations. Sometimes we need to move to a new tool because the current tools are limited. Sometimes it's really a process or a people problem, and the tool isn't the limiting factor. But even still, it is really critical to document these limitations because these limitations can often be affiliated with pain for the stakeholders or rationale for having to move to a new technology. And the last is understanding how tools and data impact people and process. At the end of the day, most IT systems are meant to interface with people, and they can only be as effective as that interface. A person is going to need to do something with that data, enter that information, use the output to do something within the process. So this interface is extremely important. So in summary, beware of poor process design. It surrounds us everywhere, and there's constantly this pressure to blindly automate, use a new fancy technology, but with poor process design, you're going to end up with a poor process and poor experience. Follow a methodology. I gave you an example today of the methodology we use, but there are many other frameworks that can be used for work like this. What is most important is that you follow a methodology. The one that we have works very well for us, and I'd be happy to discuss it more with you if you're interested. But the most critical part, and I've said it 3 times already, is follow a methodology. The last is you get out what you put in. If you simply try to buy a fancy tool and throw it into your current environment without the proper time and resources to properly implement, you're going to end up with that poor process, that poor customer experience, and typically a pretty large price tag. So if you have any questions, please shoot me an email. I would be happy to discuss any of this further with you. The other thing is I wanted to push other on-demand sessions that my colleagues are doing. Here you can see our 3 other on-demand sessions listed out. I can highly recommend each one of them. They're all very different. We cover different topics, but they're all extremely thought-provoking, and I highly recommend. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of the EDUCAUSE 2020 conference, and thank you for coming to my presentation today.